James had always been the kind of man who valued consistency and stability. For nearly 30 years, he had worked at Howard Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing company that had been a staple of his hometown. James wasn't just an employee, he was a fixture in the company. Everyone knew him. He was the dependable, hard-working guy who showed up early, stayed late, and never hesitated to lend a hand when someone needed help. He had worked his way up from a warehouse assistant to a senior manager. Now, as he neared the finish line of his career, James had one goal in mind: to retire quietly, with a small pension, a modest house in the suburbs, and enough free time to spend with his wife, children, and grandchildren. It was a Monday morning like any other, the air crisp with the early autumn chill. James arrived at work a little earlier than usual, as he did every day. The parking lot was almost empty, save for a few early risers getting their coffee from the vending machines. He grabbed his thermos, filled with a hot cup of coffee, and headed to his desk, which was located in the corner of the office, near the windows that overlooked the factory floor. He liked that spot, quiet, serene, and with a view of everything going on in the company. As he settled into his chair, he thought about the days ahead, the final few months of his career. The past few years had been marked by a sense of calm. There were no major challenges, no huge projects that required late nights or excessive travel. It had been routine, predictable. The kind of life James had always dreamed of. The young, eager go-getters were now the ones running the show, and James could take a step back and relax. His team was competent, and his manager, Mr. Anderson, rarely made waves. Anderson was a man of few words, distant and cold in his demeanor. Some of the younger employees found him difficult to approach, but James had worked with him for years and had developed a quiet respect for him. They didn't share personal stories or engage in friendly banter, but James always thought of Anderson as a man who appreciated hard work and loyalty, two qualities James held dear. It was the kind of relationship James valued, based on mutual respect but devoid of personal attachment. But today, something felt different. As the morning dragged on, James noticed an unusual sense of urgency in the office. People were moving around quickly, talking in hushed tones. It wasn't like the usual Monday rhythm. By mid-morning, James received a call from the receptionist, informing him that Mr. Anderson wanted to see him in his office immediately. James froze. He hadn't received a summons like this in years. He had always been someone who was asked to attend meetings only when it was absolutely necessary, and it had always been for something positive. Maybe it was about his upcoming retirement party, he thought. After all, he had been a loyal employee for nearly 3 decades. Surely, he had earned that much. He stood up, straightening his tie and adjusting the sleeves of his dress shirt. He made his way down the long corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. As he approached Anderson's office, he could see through the frosted glass that Anderson was already sitting behind his desk, his arms crossed and his gaze focused on the stack of paperwork in front of him. Anderson looked up as James entered, and without a smile or a word of greeting, he motioned for James to sit. "James, I've called you in today because we need to discuss your future with the company," Anderson said, his voice flat and emotionless. James's heart skipped a beat. He was used to these kinds of meetings being about retirement plans, health benefits, or something along those lines. But the tone in Anderson's voice made him uneasy. James nodded, trying to keep his composure. "Sure, what's on your mind?" Anderson paused for a moment, his eyes shifting from the papers on his desk to James. "James, we've been reviewing the performance of all senior staff, and I'm afraid we've come to a decision." He cleared his throat, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "We're going to have to let you go." James's mind went blank. He had heard the words, but they didn't make sense. Let him go? After all these years? He felt as though the room had closed in on him. He stared at Anderson, his thoughts scrambling for any rational explanation. What do you mean, let me go?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid your performance has not met the company's current standards," Anderson said, his gaze shifting back to the paperwork in front of him. "We've reviewed your recent work, and there are areas where we need more from you. This is the company's decision." James felt his throat tighten. Performance issues? He had always been one of the highest performers in the company. He had led teams through difficult projects, mentored younger staff, and helped improve company processes. He had received praise from clients and superiors alike. So, where was this coming from? "I've been with this company for almost 30 years, Anderson," James said, his voice growing steadier, but the disbelief still evident. "I've given everything to this place. There's no way this is about my performance." Anderson didn't respond immediately. He glanced at James, but his expression remained unchanged. "I understand your frustration, James. But the decision is final. I suggest you pack up your things and head home for the day. HR will be in touch with your severance package." James's hands shook as he processed the information. Severance package? This couldn't be happening. He had one foot out the door, ready to step into retirement, and now this? The sense of betrayal surged through him like a tidal wave. He tried to hold on to his composure, but it was difficult. He had always been proud of his dedication to the company, and now, after nearly 3 decades, he was being unceremoniously tossed aside. "I don't understand, Anderson," James said, his voice now steady with anger. "I've given my heart and soul to this company. And you're telling me it's just over?" Anderson looked up from his desk, his eyes cold and distant. "James, it's just business. There's nothing personal about it." James stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He couldn't stay there any longer. The conversation felt like an insult, a slap to the face of everything he had worked for. As he turned to leave, Anderson's voice stopped him. "I'm sorry, James." "This is for the best," Anderson said, but the words rang hollow, as if Anderson himself didn't believe them. James left the office, the weight of the moment pressing down on him with every step. He passed by his co-workers, some of whom gave him sympathetic glances, but no one said anything. It was as if they were all too afraid to speak up. James could feel the eyes on him as he walked to his desk for the last time, gathering his things slowly. His mind was reeling, but he couldn't make sense of it. How had it come to this? Why now, when retirement was just a few months away? As James walked out of the office for the last time, he felt a mix of emotions: disbelief, anger, sadness. He had always believed that hard work and loyalty meant something, that they would be rewarded in the end. But now, all of that seemed meaningless. He was just another casualty of a system that didn't care about the people who had built it. Little did he know, this moment, this decision, would spark a chain of events that would not only change his life but the entire community around him. James sat in his car for what seemed like an eternity after leaving the office. The engine was still running, but he didn't have the energy to turn it off. He couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The feeling of disbelief washed over him again and again, but it still didn't make sense. He had been loyal to that company, committed to its growth, its success. How could they just throw him out with no explanation, no recognition, no care for the years he had invested? He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His thoughts raced through his mind: years of late nights, early mornings, missed holidays, and family events. All of it seemed like it had been for nothing. The sacrifices he had made for the company were now just memories, swept away by a decision made in a cold office. And for what? Performance issues? It didn't make sense. James knew his work ethic. He knew the contributions he had made. There was no way his performance was ever lacking, not in any meaningful way. So why was he being treated like this? As he sat in the car, trying to process the shock, his phone buzzed. It was his wife, Tanya. She had known about his upcoming retirement party, but James hadn't told her about the meeting with Anderson yet. He felt a wave of guilt rush over him as he picked up the phone. "Hey, babe," Tanya's voice came through, warm and comforting, a stark contrast to the cold numbness James was feeling. "How did the meeting go? Did they mention the retirement party details?" James couldn't respond right away. He wanted to tell her everything, but the words didn't come. Instead, he just let out a long, frustrated sigh. "James? What's wrong?" I've been let go," James finally said, his voice shaky. "Anderson fired me, Tanya. Just like that. After all these years, he fired me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. James could almost hear the disbelief in Tanya's silence. "What do you mean, fired you? But you're about to retire. You've been there for almost 30 years. "I know, I don't get it either," James replied, his voice faltering. "He said it was because of performance issues, but that doesn't make sense. I've been one of the most dependable employees in that company. I've given everything for them." Tanya's voice grew more urgent, a touch of anger creeping in. "That doesn't sound right. You don't just get fired after all these years for some vague excuse like that. James, there has to be more to it. Are you sure there's not something else going on?" "I don't know, Tanya," James admitted. "I don't know what to think. It just doesn't make sense. It feels like I was just tossed aside." Tanya's voice softened. "Listen, we'll figure this out. I know this is a shock, but we'll figure it out together. Just come home, okay?" He didn't know how to respond. His mind was a mess of anger, confusion, and frustration. But Tanya's voice gave him some comfort, as it always had. He started the car and drove home, but the weight of the day's events hung over him like a cloud. When James walked through the door of their modest home, Tanya was already there, waiting for him. She stood up from the couch, her face a mixture of concern and disbelief. Without a word, she wrapped him in a hug. It was a simple gesture, but it was all he needed. Tanya had always been his rock, the person who knew him better than anyone else. She didn't need to ask any more questions. She could see the devastation in his eyes. "I don't understand," James muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "How could they do this to me? After everything I've done for them?" Tanya gently pulled away, taking his hand in hers. "James, we're going to get to the bottom of this. You've worked too hard for this company to let it end like this." But James wasn't so sure. His confidence, the sense of security he had always taken for granted, had been shattered in that office. He thought about all the years he had dedicated to Howard Industries. He had worked tirelessly, built relationships, been a mentor to younger employees, and had sacrificed countless hours with his family for the company. It was supposed to pay off. It was supposed to mean something. But now, in the span of a few minutes, it all felt worthless. The next few days passed in a blur. James tried to keep his routine as normal as possible, but everything felt off. He went through the motions, making coffee in the morning, reading the newspaper, doing the small tasks around the house, but nothing held any joy. It felt like he was just marking time, waiting for something, anything, to make sense of what had happened. Tanya pushed him to look into his options, to talk to a lawyer, to see if there was a case to be made against the company. But James wasn't sure he was ready for that kind of battle. He had always prided himself on keeping a low profile, staying out of drama. The idea of taking on Howard Industries in court seemed overwhelming. He wasn't even sure if it was worth it. What would he be fighting for? Money? A chance to return to a company that had just discarded him? But as the days went by, the anger began to build inside him. The sense of injustice gnawed at him, especially as he heard whispers around town about how employees who were nearing retirement or approaching the age of 50 were quietly being let go. There were rumors of younger, cheaper replacements being hired. It wasn't just James, it was a trend. He started to wonder if there was something more sinister going on at Howard Industries. It was a few days after the firing that James ran into one of his former colleagues, Derek, at the local coffee shop. Derek was younger, in his late 30s, and had worked in a similar role at the company. They exchanged pleasantries, but it was clear there was an awkward tension between them. After some small talk, Derek finally spoke up. "James, I don't know how to say this, but I think you were set up. This isn't about your performance. There's something more going on at Howard Industries. I think you're not the first one." James frowned. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Derek looked around, making sure no one was eavesdropping. "I've heard some things. Older employees, those close to retirement, they've been pushed out. Anderson and some of the other executives are trying to make cuts, and they're going after people who are nearing the end of their careers. They're replacing them with younger, cheaper workers. I think you were just a casualty of that plan." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He had suspected something was off, but hearing it from someone else made it feel all too real. It wasn't just about performance or his age, it was a corporate decision. It was a business move. James sat there for a moment, processing what Derek had said. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. Anderson hadn't fired him because of his performance. He had fired him because of his age, his looming retirement, and the fact that James had become a liability in their eyes. In their quest to cut costs and push out older employees, James had become expendable. He thanked Derek for the information and left the coffee shop in a daze. As he walked to his car, the reality of what he was facing began to sink in. He wasn't just a victim of a bad decision, he was a victim of a system that valued profit over people. And it wasn't just him, there were others like him, older workers who had dedicated their lives to the company, only to be discarded when they were no longer seen as valuable. That night, as James lay in bed, Tanya's words echoed in his mind, "We'll figure this out." But James wasn't sure how. Would the company even listen? Would anyone care? The anger that had been brewing inside him began to solidify into something more. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about standing up for what was right, about giving a voice to those who had been silenced by corporate greed. And maybe, just maybe, he could be the one to do something about it. James awoke the next morning with a new sense of determination. The disillusionment that had clouded his mind for the past few days had shifted into a burning desire for justice. He had been wronged, not just by Anderson, but by a system that prioritized profits over people. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a growing number of employees who were quietly being replaced with younger, cheaper workers. If no one spoke out, if no one challenged what was happening, more people like him would fall victim to this corporate greed. He couldn't let that happen. But James knew this wouldn't be easy. He wasn't an activist, wasn't someone who'd ever made waves in the corporate world. He'd always kept his head down, done his job, and focused on providing for his family. This wasn't the fight he'd imagined for his final years of work. But now that he had the truth, he couldn't ignore it. The longer he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about keeping his dignity intact, it was about standing up for the people who couldn't speak out for themselves. He sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him as his mind raced. Tanya could see the shift in him, the way he was no longer consumed by despair but instead focused, planning. She walked over to him and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "What's going through your mind?" she asked, her voice soft but full of concern. She knew her husband well enough to know that when James got quiet, he was in the midst of something significant. "I'm not just going to sit back and let this happen," he said, his voice firm. "There are more people like me, people who have given everything to that company. People who are being pushed out and replaced by younger workers. It's not right. It's not just about me. It's about the system they've built to exploit people like us. Tanya sat down across from him, meeting his gaze. So, what are you going to do about it? James leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing in determination. I'm going to expose them. I'm going to make sure people know what's really going on at Howard Industries. I'm going to fight back, for me and for the people who don't have a voice in this. Tanya's expression softened, a mixture of pride and worry in her eyes. I know you want to do the right thing, James, but you need to be careful. This isn't going to be easy, and it could backfire. You've spent your whole life building a reputation with that company. If you go after them, it might destroy that. James sighed, rubbing his temples. I know, but it's a risk I have to take. If I don't do something, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have done more. I've already lost my job, I can't lose my integrity too. Tanya didn't say anything for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. Finally, she spoke. Okay, but you're not doing this alone. We'll figure it out together. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and careful planning. James knew he needed to gather as much evidence as he could to prove what was happening at Howard Industries. He wasn't going to make accusations without something solid to back them up. He started reaching out to old colleagues, people he trusted, people who might be willing to speak up. He was careful, though, not to tip his hand too soon. This needed to be done methodically, carefully, and with precision. One evening, after dinner, James met with Derek again. They sat in a quiet corner of a local bar, the low hum of conversation around them barely registering as they spoke. Derek, I need your help, James said, his voice low. I'm going after Anderson, after the whole system that's been pushing people like us out. But I need something concrete, something I can take to the authorities. Derek's eyes shifted nervously, his fingers tapping on the glass in front of him. I don't know, James. This is dangerous. If you push too hard, they'll come after you. They've got the power. They'll shut you down before you even get started. I don't care anymore, James replied, his voice hardening. I've got nothing left to lose. I'll be damned if I let them destroy more lives just because they can. People like you and me, people who've given their best years to that company, are being discarded like trash. Derek hesitated, his gaze darting around the room. After a long pause, he finally spoke. Okay. But this isn't going to be easy. I can't go public with anything, but I can help you find the right people. I know some people in HR who have seen things, heard things. I can make a few calls, see what I can dig up. James nodded, grateful but wary. I don't want anyone to get hurt. But I need this. We need to expose what they're doing. Over the next week, Derek came through. He helped James get in touch with several former employees, some of whom had already left Howard Industries and were living in nearby towns. They all had stories of being let go or forced out as they neared retirement, pushed aside for younger, cheaper replacements. They all spoke of Anderson's cold demeanor, his obsession with profit margins, and the way he would talk about cutting costs and finding ways to reduce overhead. It was becoming clear to James that what had happened to him was part of a much larger, systemic issue, one that had been going on for years. But even with all the new information, James knew that it wasn't enough. The company was powerful. They had lawyers, resources, and a well-established network to protect themselves. James needed more. He needed hard evidence, something indisputable that would force the public to take notice. Then, a breakthrough came. Derek called him late one night, his voice urgent. James, I got it. I got the smoking gun. James felt a jolt of adrenaline shoot through him. What do you mean? What did you find? I got my hands on an internal memo. It's from Anderson himself. It's a clear directive to the HR department about firing employees who are nearing retirement age and replacing them with younger workers. It's all spelled out, right there in black and white. This is it, James. This is what we need. James felt his heart race as he processed the information. This was what he had been waiting for. With this document, he had the proof he needed to expose the truth. This wasn't just about his firing anymore, it was about all the employees who had been silently pushed aside, their years of hard work discarded in favor of a younger, cheaper workforce. But as the excitement began to settle in, James also felt a wave of fear. This could change everything. It could bring down Howard Industries, or at least expose their dark practices. But it also meant he would be going up against one of the most powerful corporations in the region. If he didn't do this right, it could ruin him. The decision weighed heavily on him, but as he thought about the faces of the people he had spoken to, the workers who had been treated unfairly, the families that had been affected, he knew there was no turning back. He had to move forward. He had to fight. And with that, the plan began to take shape. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be fast, but James was prepared to take down the system that had wronged him, and countless others. This wasn't just about getting revenge, it was about making sure this didn't happen again, making sure no one else was pushed aside like he had been. It was about standing up for what was right. James had gathered the evidence, the pieces of the puzzle that had haunted him for days, weeks, months. But as the weight of the moment set in, the full gravity of what he was about to do began to hit him. He wasn't just taking on his former employer, he was challenging a system that had been in place for decades, a system that relied on silence, conformity, and fear. The repercussions of his actions would ripple far beyond his own life. He stood in front of his mirror that evening, his reflection staring back at him with uncertainty and resolve. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly. He had never imagined he would be here, at the edge of something so dangerous, so pivotal. But as he thought about the faces of his former colleagues, many of whom were still stuck in the same exhausting cycle, he found his resolve hardening once more. He couldn't turn back. The next day, James sat at his desk in the small apartment he and Tanya had moved into after his firing. They had downsized, everything seemed smaller and quieter now, but the emotional toll had created an insurmountable distance between the life they had known and the uncertainty ahead. He had already started to prepare for the worst, he might lose everything, but what did he have left to lose? His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his train of thought. Derek. James picked up the phone, his voice tight. What do you have for me? Derek's voice was low, but there was a hint of urgency in it. I spoke to some people in HR again. They're starting to get nervous. Word is, there's talk of a meeting next week about the layoffs, and you, James. It's clear that Anderson's getting desperate. He doesn't know how much we know yet, but it's only a matter of time. James's heart sank. The more Derek talked, the clearer it became, the corporation wasn't just looking to silence him, they were preparing to shut him down, to bury everything before it gained traction. They knew they had the power to destroy him. And they would. But James was prepared. He had anticipated this. He had anticipated that Anderson would try to bury the truth. He wasn't going to let that happen. With or without support, he would go public. He would make sure the world knew what had happened at Howard Industries. I need to take this to the media, James said, his voice steady now. We can't wait any longer. If we do, it'll be too late. Derek hesitated on the other end of the line. Are you sure? You know what that means, right? Once it's out there, there's no going back. I know. But I've already lost everything. It's not just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been wronged by them. There was a long pause, then Derek's voice came through, quieter, but resolute. All right. Let's do it. I'll make the calls. We'll get you the exposure you need." Within the hour, James found himself sitting in front of a journalist from the local news station, a young woman named Jessica, who seemed both professional and empathetic. She had listened to his story, had absorbed all the details, and was now looking at him with a mixture of concern and understanding. The meeting was held in the back corner of a small cafe, away from prying eyes. "I don't want to make any promises, Mr. Williams," Jessica said, her voice gentle but firm. "But this kind of story could really shake things up. It's a good story, it's a story that needs to be heard. But we'll need proof. Solid proof. We'll need the internal documents you have. We'll need more than just your word." James nodded. He had come prepared. He pulled out the memo, the one Derek had helped him acquire, the one that confirmed the systematic targeting of older employees, the directive straight from Anderson's office. He handed it over with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside him. Jessica took the document, examining it closely. "This could be the smoking gun we need," she said, her eyes scanning the paper quickly. "But I'll need to cross-check this, get confirmation from other sources. I can't just take your word for it, and I can't just take this document at face value. But if this checks out..." "It will," James said firmly. "I've seen the patterns. I've spoken to former employees, to people who have left or been fired. This is just the tip of the iceberg." Jessica nodded, her expression serious. "We'll run with this, Mr. Williams. I'll be in touch." James left the cafe feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. He had taken the first step, the one that couldn't be undone, but he had no idea what would happen next. There was a chance, perhaps a small one, that this would blow over, that Howard Industries would sweep it under the rug and continue as if nothing had happened. But there was also the very real possibility that this would turn into a battle, a fight that he wasn't sure he could win. As the days passed, James began to feel the weight of anticipation bearing down on him. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from Derek, with news of the story spreading through the media. Journalists from other outlets had picked it up. Whispers of the scandal were spreading like wildfire, and soon enough, James's phone rang with an unfamiliar number. It was Jessica. "It's out there, Mr. Williams," she said, her voice calm but strained. "Your story's breaking tonight. The first wave is already online, and the public's responding. But Anderson's not taking this lying down." James's heart raced. "What do you mean?" "They're already fighting back. Howard Industries is claiming that the documents are fake, that they've been tampered with. They're questioning your credibility, and they're launching a campaign to discredit you." James clenched his fists. He knew this was coming, but it still stung. The battle had begun, and he had to be ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore, it was about survival. The next few days were a whirlwind. News outlets were covering the story, but it wasn't all positive. Anderson and the company's PR machine were working overtime to paint James as a disgruntled former employee with a vendetta. They questioned his motivations, his character, and the authenticity of the evidence he had provided. But James wasn't backing down. He had his support. Derek was still in touch, feeding him more information, more names, more pieces of the puzzle. The public began to turn. The media couldn't ignore the mounting pressure. As more former employees came forward, corroborating James's claims, the truth started to break through the noise. Anderson's carefully constructed facade began to crack, and soon, there was no turning back. James's story was now not just about one man's fight for justice, it was about the exploitation of older workers, the systemic practices that had been hidden for so long. It was about corporate greed, about the abuse of power, and about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. And the cost was high. As the story gained traction, James found himself in the middle of a media storm. His name was on every news channel, the subject of heated debates and discussions. But there was no doubt in his mind that he had made the right choice. He was standing tall, not just for himself, but for all the workers who had been silenced, for all the people who had been pushed aside in the name of profit. But the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days that followed the media blitz were a blur. The news coverage on James's story reached a fever pitch, with reporters from across the country picking up the scandal. The tide was turning, and while James could feel the weight of that shift, there was also a sense of dread. Anderson and Howard Industries weren't going to let this go easily. Every new headline, every new story that emerged brought an increasingly personal attack on his character. James hadn't anticipated how vicious the response would be. The social media trolls were relentless. They flooded comment sections with accusations, some questioning his integrity, others labeling him as a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. But the worst part wasn't the vitriol online, it was the whispers behind the scenes. It didn't take long for James to hear about the pressure being applied to Derek, who had helped him get the crucial documents. Derek had been quiet for the past few days, and when James finally reached him, his voice was strained, almost unrecognizable. "James, we need to talk. It's getting worse. They've been reaching out to anyone connected to this, anyone who might have information. People I've spoken to are starting to back off. They're scared." James's gut clenched. "What are you saying? What's happening?" "They're threatening people. Not just with legal action but more than that. It's the old tactics, James. You know how it works. They're making people afraid. I'm not sure how long I can keep this going. They've been calling me, telling me I'm making a mistake, telling me to stop." James's heart pounded. The stakes had escalated. This wasn't just a fight for his reputation anymore. This was a full-scale war. Howard Industries had the resources to crush anyone who got in their way. But James wasn't backing down, not now, not after everything he had uncovered. "You've already done the right thing, Derek. You've helped more than you know," James said, trying to steady his voice. "If you need to step back, I'll understand. But I can't stop now. I've come too far." Derek didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched between them. Finally, he spoke again, his voice small, almost a whisper. "I don't know if I can keep going, James. They're offering me things, money, protection, a way out. But I see what you're doing. And I can't just leave you to fight this alone." James's throat tightened as he heard the uncertainty in his friend's voice. Derek had always been a fighter, a man of principle. To hear him this shaken, this close to quitting, was a stark reminder of just how powerful Howard Industries was. But James wasn't going to let fear drive his decisions. "I'll be fine," James said, though he wasn't sure if he truly believed it. "But if you're going to help, I need you to stick with me. No backing out now." Derek was silent for a long moment, and then James heard the faintest exhale, followed by a soft sigh. "All right. I'll stick with you. But we need to act fast. The longer we wait, the more ground we lose." James's resolve hardened. He had fought for so long to get this far, and he wasn't about to let the company's fear tactics stop him now. He and Derek had already gone too far to back out. The support from former employees was growing. A few brave souls had already come forward, willing to share their own stories of being manipulated, silenced, or dismissed. James knew it was only a matter of time before their voices were louder than the company's. He could feel the shift happening, the momentum building. With Derek's help, James set up meetings with investigative journalists and lawyers. It was time to take things to the next level. The news about Howard Industries was everywhere now. People were waking up to the corruption that had been happening for years. But James knew this wasn't going to be a quick fix. The company was prepared to fight back, to discredit him, to tear apart his life if necessary. One morning, as James sat in his small kitchen going over the mounting documents with Tanya, his phone rang again. It was Jessica, the journalist who had been covering his story from the beginning. James's heart skipped a beat. She had been the one to break the story to the public. She had been his voice when everything seemed hopeless. If she was calling, it could mean something huge. "James," Jessica said, her voice shaking with excitement. "You're not going to believe this, but we've just gotten confirmation from multiple sources inside Howard Industries. The internal audit, the documents that showed Anderson's directive, it's all true. This isn't just hearsay anymore. The company's own financials back it up. This is it. This is the moment we've been waiting for." James's chest tightened with a mix of relief and anxiety. "So it's happening. It's going public?" "It's happening, James," Jessica confirmed. "We've got everything we need. The story's running tonight. We've got interviews from former employees, documentation that ties Anderson to the decisions he made, and confirmation from whistleblowers inside the company. This is the real deal. The public is going to see the truth, and they're not going to be able to ignore it." James could hardly believe it. After everything, after all the sleepless nights, the fighting, the tension, it was finally happening. But with the thrill came the undeniable weight of what came next. The battle with Howard Industries wasn't over, it had only just begun. As the hours passed, the anticipation continued to build. Tanya could see it in James's eyes, the quiet storm of nerves and excitement. He was walking a fine line between victory and peril. If the story hit the mainstream the way they hoped, the company would be forced to answer for their actions. But James had seen how powerful they were. He knew that once the story broke, there would be no going back. Later that evening, as the story went live, James sat in the small living room, his eyes fixed on the TV. The screen flickered, and then Jessica's face appeared, her voice steady as she recounted the damning evidence against Howard Industries. She laid out the timeline of events, the internal memos, and the testimonies of those who had come forward to speak the truth. The words echoed in James's ears: systemic age discrimination, secret layoff plans, and corporate greed that pushed out loyal employees. James could feel the rush of adrenaline as he watched the story unfold on screen. This was the moment of reckoning, the culmination of everything he had worked for. But even as the truth was being exposed, he couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread. What would come next? Would this bring justice, or would the company's influence be enough to erase everything? His phone buzzed again. It was Derek. "You did it, James," Derek's voice said, breathless. "The story's everywhere. People are talking. The response is huge." James leaned back in his chair, his hand gripping the phone tightly. "This isn't over yet, Derek. Not by a long shot. But we've done it. We've made sure the truth got out. It was a victory, but only the first step in a long, grueling battle. The fight for justice had only just begun." As James looked over at Tanya, the woman who had stood by him through everything, he knew that no matter what came next, they had already won something far more valuable than any paycheck or corporate recognition: the truth. In the days that followed the broadcast of the story, the fallout from James's decision hit in waves. The media frenzy intensified, with Howard Industries scrambling to control the damage. The once imposing corporation, a juggernaut in its industry, was now on its heels. Every statement they released seemed to backfire, and their attempts to discredit James only made the public rally more strongly behind him. The story was everywhere, on news channels, in blogs, on social media. It felt like the world had finally woken up to the reality of what James had been through. But the public spotlight, which had once seemed like a distant fantasy, now bore down on him with a weight he wasn't sure he was prepared for. It wasn't just the media attention that was overwhelming, it was the sheer number of people who came out of the woodwork to offer their support or share their own stories of mistreatment. Emails flooded his inbox, some from former colleagues at Howard Industries, others from complete strangers who had experienced similar injustices. Every new message made him feel both hopeful and burdened, knowing that exposing the truth had sparked a conversation long overdue, but also that there were so many people still suffering in silence. One evening, as James sat at his desk trying to sift through the dozens of emails, Tanya walked in. Her expression was one of quiet concern, her brows furrowed as she looked at the computer screen in front of him. "James, I need to talk to you," she said softly. He looked up from the screen, his eyes tired but determined. "What's wrong?" "I'm proud of what you've done," she began, her voice steady, "but this is bigger than we thought. The pressure's only going to get worse. Have you thought about the long-term consequences? What comes next?" James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with one hand. "I know. I've been thinking about it constantly. The company's not going to let this go. I've already gotten threats, Tanya. You heard what Derek said, they're pulling out all the stops to intimidate people. But we can't let them bury this. Too many lives are at stake." Tanya sat down across from him, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and worry. She had always supported him, but the weight of what he was carrying had started to take its toll on her as well. "I know. But you've already lost so much. I don't want to see you lose more. What happens if they come after us next? If they try to take everything we have?" James exhaled sharply, the reality of what they were up against settling deeper within him. "I don't know. But I can't stop now. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about all the people who've been mistreated, the ones who've had their voices silenced. We've already made so much progress, and I can't turn back now." Tanya placed her hand on his, her grip firm, though her eyes betrayed a mixture of fear and admiration. "I'll stand by you, James. You know that. But just be careful. This fight is bigger than you think." James nodded, grateful for her unwavering support. But even as he acknowledged the risks, a sense of purpose filled him. There was no going back. The truth had to be heard, and he was the one who had set it in motion. The choice was no longer his to make, he was a part of something much larger than himself now. The following weeks were filled with a dizzying series of events. As the scandal snowballed, James found himself in meetings with lawyers, journalists, and even activists, all of whom were eager to lend their support. But with every victory came new threats, new tactics from Howard Industries designed to break his resolve. He received phone calls in the middle of the night, ominous messages from unknown numbers warning him to back off or face the consequences. His personal life was under a microscope, his every move being scrutinized by the very same people who once praised him for his loyalty and hard work. But nothing could shake his determination. He knew that if he gave up now, it would send the message that silence was easier than truth. He refused to be a part of that legacy. Then came the moment that would change everything. A group of whistleblowers from inside Howard Industries reached out to James. They had gathered irrefutable proof, more memos, emails, and financial documents that confirmed not only the age discrimination James had uncovered but also a broader, more insidious pattern of corporate malfeasance that spanned years. These weren't just isolated incidents. These were systemic practices designed to manipulate the workforce, to silence those who questioned the company's decisions, to prioritize profit over people's lives. James knew this was the tipping point. This wasn't just about standing up for himself anymore. This was about changing the very system that allowed powerful corporations to thrive on the backs of their employees. With this new evidence, he could bring down Howard Industries for good. But he had to act fast. The company had already begun its counteroffensive, and the longer they had to cover up their tracks, the more dangerous it became for James and anyone associated with the truth. It was time to take things to the next level. The first step was reaching out to the right people. James, with Derek's help, managed to secure a meeting with a high-profile law firm that specialized in corporate whistleblower cases. The firm had a reputation for taking on the most powerful companies, and their success rate was unmatched. The partner he met with, a woman named Allison, listened intently as James laid out the evidence. "This is more than just a lawsuit," Allison said after a long silence. "What you're sitting on could change the course of an entire industry. We're talking about systemic corruption, age discrimination, retaliation against employees who speak out. It's all here. And it's not just Howard Industries. This is a cultural problem in corporate America." James felt a surge of hope as he listened to her. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. There were people who cared about this fight, people who had the resources and power to make a real difference. But that hope was tempered by the knowledge that the battle would be long and costly. "We'll help you take this to court," Allison continued, "but it's going to take time. It's going to be a battle. And we'll need to be strategic. The company will fight dirty. We're already preparing for that." James nodded. "I understand. But I'm in this for the long haul. I can't back down now. Too much is at stake." Over the next few months, the legal battle escalated. James, Tanya, and Derek found themselves tangled in a web of legal proceedings, court dates, depositions, and media appearances. The pressure was unrelenting. James felt like he was living two lives, one in the spotlight, where he was the face of corporate reform, and the other in the quiet moments at home, where the fear of losing everything loomed large. And then, just when it seemed like the company had done everything to suppress the truth, a breakthrough came. A former high-ranking executive from Howard Industries, one who had been working behind the scenes to cover up the illegal practices, came forward. She provided a bombshell testimony that corroborated everything James had claimed and more. With her testimony, the case took on a life of its own. The media coverage exploded once again, and this time, Howard Industries couldn't spin the narrative in their favor. The public outcry was deafening. James had finally done it. The company, once an untouchable titan, was now under investigation by the Department of Justice. The executives who had orchestrated the illegal practices were being held accountable. The tide had turned in a way that James had never imagined possible. But even with the victory within reach, James knew this was just the beginning. The fight had taken everything from him, his job, his security, his privacy. But in return, it had given him something far more valuable, the chance to change the system. The chance to make a real difference. And as he stood in the middle of this storm, with the weight of the truth behind him, he knew one thing for certain: the battle was never just about a paycheck or a promotion. It was about justice, and no matter how hard they fought, they couldn't take that away.